Hello, and welcome to this week's live weekly warm-up. For this one, we're continuing this theme that we've been doing over the past couple of weeks, where we're sort of taking exercises that are traditionally long tone or technique or articulation exercise, and we're changing it up a little bit and turning it into a new and different kind of exercise. So for this week, we're going to be taking a long tone exercise, the over the break long tones from the next generation clarinet method, and we're going to be turning them into an articulation exercise. So the first week we did technique exercises, long tones. Last week we did a long tone exercise as technique. Now we're doing a long tone exercise as articulation. So this should be pretty fun. And I think next week actually we'll do a technique exercise as an articulation exercise as well. So for this one, what we're going to do is take these long tones and all we're going to do is add in tongue motion, because remember that the only difference between long tones and articulation is long tones are focusing on good sound quality, good connections between notes. Articulation is the same thing, but with your tongue moving so that you can work on your tongue motion. So we can literally just take plain long tones and add the articulation in. And this is a little bit different and a little bit easier actually than changing a long tone to technique or technique to long tone, because we don't really even have to change what we do with the notes. When we did the Christmas tree long tones, for example, as a technique exercise, we sort of made it a little bit longer, because in a technique exercise, it goes by really fast, but in a long tone exercise, it goes by much slower. So we have to add more notes to make it a full length exercise. For articulation, you don't have to do that at all, actually. The long tones translate perfectly just with articulation. Technique translates perfectly just with articulation. You can think of this in when you play scales, even if it's just a 2-octave scale. I always recommend doing technique exercises, slurring everything, but lots of people tongue their scales, and that's a perfect example of turning a technique exercise into an articulation exercise. But for this week, let me start by showing you just what the normal over the break long tones sound like, and then I'll add in the articulation and talk about what's really important to think about changing and how the exercise changes with the articulation in it. So this is the long tones, how the long tones normally go. And even now, just to demonstrate, if there's anything that I hear that I don't like, I'm going to stop and do it again, because I want to build up that muscle memory and build up that training for how I really want it to go, not just whatever happens. But that's how it goes as a long tone. Now, what I'm going to do as an articulation exercise, I'm still going to hold the first note long. I really like in all articulation exercises to hold the first note long, because that sort of trains you to know where that note is, how that note sounds its very best, and then add in the tongue motion. And once the tongue motion gets added in, keeping that same quality of sound from the long tones. So what I'm going to do is the same exercise. I'm going to hold an extra first note to hold that long, and then I'm going to start tonguing, and I'm just going to do the same rhythms approximately, but now I'm going to tongue 16th notes rather than just playing the halves, quarters, and eighths that I just played. And that would go something like this. So you can hear it's very simple, very straightforward to go from long tones to articulation. It's pretty much just adding in articulation. But this is a great exercise and really becomes actually quite a powerful exercise for working on these things, learning how to get your tongue moving really well. The thing that I think most people sort of make the mistake of when they start articulating is they lose the sound quality, where you might sound great, beautiful when you're slurring, but then once the tongue starts moving, things change, the sound quality changes, and it's not as good anymore. So the trick here is to have that long tone. And the beauty of this exercise is you have that long tone example, especially if you play it as a long tone right before, like I just did. And then you can hear if there's any quality changes as you go to articulate. So something that might happen, and I'll just even demonstrate this on the very first note, is you might get something like this. So you could hear, hopefully, that the long tone was beautiful, had a really nice sustain to it. Then I started tonguing and the sound quality changed. The tongue, the note shapes wasn't consistent, so it wasn't as nice. Another thing that could happen in this exercise in particular is maybe something like this. You can hear how on the high note, now the note's not coming out clearly. Maybe as the long tone, it happens no problem. You play the low C, it goes up to the high G, it sounds great, you're supporting with good air, you have good embouchure, all that stuff, and it works fine. But then when you add the articulation, it no longer works fine. And what that means is that you need to figure out what's going wrong with your tongue, what's changing when you start touching your tongue to the reed that's messing up your air quality, messing up your embouchure quality, and changing the quality of sound. So as you're doing this exercise, think about those things. Think about how you can make it sound great as a long tone. Think about how you can add in the articulation, get the separations between the notes, get the note shapes that you want, make that consistent, and keep the quality of sound. That's what makes a great articulation exercise. Again, no matter what notes you're playing, you can play any notes that you want. You just need to make sure that you're keeping that quality of sound as you get those consistent note shapes. So I hope that this has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions about this, be sure to leave them in the comments, even if you are watching the replay of this, and I'll be happy to answer your questions as always. If you're interested in this particular over the break long tone exercise, it is in my method book, The Next Generation Clarinet Method. You can go to quickstartclarinet.com/nextgenbook to get that. If you don't have it, there's all kinds of good exercises in there. And I am excited to see how this week goes for you, challenging you to try to take a long tone exercise and put it into an articulation exercise. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in next week's live weekly warm-up.